All right. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. And welcome to our Ask the Experts webinar. My name is Scott Price, and I'll be your host for today's session. And this is our second webinar of Ask the Experts. Many more. Our intention is to present solutions that our team has developed for clients using Atlassian products. And our our manner of operation today is that we have a group of 4 experts who they're Atlassian experts, but they have specific experts in cloud migrations. And today we want to focus on cloud migration pitfalls. And so we're going to do some introductions, and then we're going to let each of our experts offer some anecdotes about different problems that they've seen and solved. And then we want to invite you to ask questions. There is a Q&A feature on your Zoom meeting. And so we would invite you to ask your questions there so that they're organized and can be resolved on screen or after. We'll do our best to address as many questions as possible, but if you happen to ask a question that we don't have the answer to, then we'll research that and get back to you at a later date. Also, this is a 1-hour webinar, so if we happen to run out of time, we want to be respectful and not go long, but in that case, we would get back to you if there's a question that we're not able to get to at that point as well. Please note that the session is being recorded, and the recording will be shared on our YouTube channel, and along with any additional resources that our experts might mention or reference during the conversation. I wanted to start off with just a couple of slides just to kind of talk about our expertise, because if we're talking about cloud migration, you probably want to know that our experts have some experience in this regard. And so this slide is just basically a testimonial slide from Northwestern Mutual. This is a migration that we did probably 2.5, 3 years ago. It was one of the first really big clients to migrate to the cloud. And incidentally, I don't know if you're aware of the statistics, but Atlassian reports that 100,000 companies have migrated to the cloud from either a server or data center. The majority of those have happened over the past few years, especially after Atlassian announced the end of support for server products. But there have been a lot of migrations to the cloud. This is one of the early, really large ones, and it had some real specific challenges. And the tooling has changed quite a bit since this time. But definitely our engineering team had to figure some things out on this one, especially regarding third-party apps. We did a Jira and Confluence migration, which was even bigger for McDonald's. 20,000 licensed users, 2 million issues, 1,200 projects. And we had a nice little thank you from McDonald's for that one. And then finally, this migration was done last year for Southwest Airlines, 31,000 users, million plus issues, 3.5 million pages in their Confluence migration. And folks on this call were involved in one or all of those migrations that were very successful. In fact, the Southwest migration was featured at Atlassian's Team 24 this year. So we've got some great migrations under our belt and a lot more to come. And so the agenda is presentation of topics, which is cloud migration pitfalls, and then Q&A. So you get to ask the experts questions that you might have queued up or you might think of during the presentation. Here are today's experts, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. David, why don't you start?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. My name is David Mitchell. I'm a consultant here at Valiantis. I've been here for a little over 3 years, going on 4 years. I'm a consultant and a delivery manager, and I work primarily with migrations here.
Awesome. Thank you. Cody?
Hi, thanks, Scott. My name is Cody Berenson. I'm an Atlassian certified expert here at Valiantis. I'm also a senior consultant. I've been with the company for almost 2 years now. And I also, like David, I also work heavily with cloud migrations.
Awesome. Conrad.
Hello, I'm Konrad Garros. I think I've been working here for 7 or 8 years already. I'm mostly a developer, system administrator, and technical consultant, focusing on solving all kinds of technical problems that customers have around migrations and elsewhere. Thanks.
Great. Rodolfo.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rodolfo. I've been working as an Atlassian consultant since 2013. I specialize in project implementations, migrations, and everything else related to Atlassian. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right. Thank you. And we're going to start off with David, and I'm going to stop sharing. We'll just focus on each other for the topic discussion. And so, David, why don't you kick us off with some anecdotes from your experience?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Scott. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to enjoy being able to just talk candidly about this topic, migrations and some of the things that we run into. When it comes to migration pitfalls, I think one of the things that we see that's very common and we see more often than anything else is an unrealistic migration timeline. And when we talk about a timeline, we're talking about the customer's expectation in terms of how long it's going to take on the calendar. It's typically, we refer to that, we're looking at a number of months, whether it's 2 months, 3 months, 4, 5, 6. It's very common for customers to want their timeline to be shorter than what's realistic relative to what it is they have to migrate. So just wanted to talk about that a little bit. There's some when we're talking about what the timeline is going to be, and we look at the customer's migration and everything that they have involved, and we tell them, give them an estimate, what we think it's going to be based on our experience, and in those cases where the customer is wanting it to be shorter, there's some misconceptions that they often have about that. One of those is that, well, let's just add more people to your team and that'll help get the work done faster. And if you add more people to your team, we can make it shorter, right? It's almost like comparing migration work to a landscaping project. Say you've got a landscaping project, you've got a couple acres of land and you've got very wooded and you've got, your plan is to mulch it and put in all of these plants and you've got 2 people doing the work. Well, if you add 2 more people to the work, you get it done twice as fast. And so the misconception is that a migration project is similar and it's that same type of work, and that adding more people just makes it get done faster. That may be done true to just a little bit of an extent, but there you get to a point to where that stops, and I'm going to explain why that is in a minute here. Another misconception is to say, well, if we just manage this project the right way, we can get this done faster. And a lot of times this will take the form of the customer bringing in a project manager from their side, and this sort of thought process takes the form of, if we have the right meetings and we manage this the right way and we say the right things in these meetings and we set the right deadlines, we can just force something to happen in a shorter timeline. Sometimes a project manager on the customer side can help. Sometimes a project manager involved can make things longer. It depends on their style of management. A project manager on the customer side can be helpful for mobilizing and managing the resources on the customer side, because it is a team effort between, if you're working with a partner, it's a team effort between the migration team on the Atlassian partner side and the team of people on the customer side as well. The reason both of these ideas can be misconceptions is because they assume that a migration process is simply a measurable quantity of linear work that has to be done, and that it's just a matter of just working through that work. And if you have more people working on it, it gets done faster. Unfortunately, I think it would be great. I think we could all agree it would be really great if that's how migrations were, but unfortunately, that's just not the nature of a cloud migration process. The nature of a cloud migration process is that, migrations are complex, complicated endeavors that have a lot of moving parts to it. There are a lot of parties involved, including various teams and stakeholders on the customer side. You'll have an Atlassian partner migration team, even potentially have some parties involved with Atlassian, like a cloud migration manager. So you've got a lot of people involved. There's also, as you go through this process, there's a variety of just reactive decisions that need to be made throughout the migration process. And those take the time that they take. You can't always control. It's a coordinated effort between a variety of parties, and you can't control and make things happen very efficiently in a linear fashion necessarily. There are also often technical issues that need to be resolved through support tickets with Atlassian, and not often. I mean, that's not. I would say always. That's just part of the migration process. Those, and the times that it takes for those technical issues to be worked out are really out of anyone's control. As a Atlassian partner or migration team working, we just don't have, there are a variety of things that we don't have control of. We have control of the work that we do, but we don't have control of the response times that we get for decision making on the partner side, from support that we get from Atlassian, for iterative testing. It's a very dynamic process. I recently had one of our customers, an engineer with one of our customers, make a statement that I really appreciated in relation to this. He's an engineer, and he said, I don't like hard deadlines because there are just too many variables in life. And I would say, there are just too many variables in a cloud migration. That's just very true. We just delivered a migration workshop 2 days ago, and part of our material that we presented we were talking about timelines, and one of the warnings that we gave out was about this sort of dynamic nature of a migration process. And one of the warnings that we gave out was to say, if you're working with a partner or some contractors who are trying to give you a very definite, hard, a definite prediction of, we can get this migration done in X amount of time, that's probably a red flag. That's, if they're not communicating to you about the dynamic nature of it, and how flexibility is important, they're probably not being honest, or they're just telling you what you want to hear to get you to sign a contract with them. So be aware of that. Let's just talk real quickly. I want to talk real quickly about some real life examples of how this plays out. We recently had a customer who wanted to get their migration done in 2 months. It wasn't realistic because with everything involved in their migration, it's more of a 3 or a 4 month process. They wanted to get it done in 2 months because they had the licenses for their add-ons expiring 2 months, and they just really felt like they wanted to get off, get off of data center and have the migration done before they expired. Those add-on expirations aren't really as critical as some customers may think. That's really beyond the scope of what I'm talking about today, so I won't get into that too much. We recently had a customer that wanted to do a 6 to 5 month migration in 5 months. The reason they wanted to do that was they had an internal event that was a very private business thing for them, and it was just important that this migration get done by the end of July, and the end of May. And if it wasn't, and they got into the time of this other event, then they would have to put it off until after that. That's a little unusual, but we do run into customers sometimes that don't have that flexibility. That's not a real good position to get yourself in if you can prevent it. I'm going to talk about that a little bit here real quickly. The overall reason that we see customers get into this situation is just simply procrastination. They put it off. And we know that because in these situations, our account representative has been talking to this customer for over a year. and then they get to the point to where they have this deadline and they're very close to some sort of deadline that they have, and so they put themselves into sort of this what I call an under the gun kind of situation, or the 11th hour. So one of the takeaways that I want to give to you today is, try to avoid getting yourself into that situation if you possibly can. Real quickly here, I want to talk about what happens if you push a timeline to be too short. It actually is possible to force a migration into a shorter timeline, but if you do, it's not anything that we would recommend, but if you do, there are some sacrifices that have to be made. You're basically going to have to sacrifice the quality of your migration in some way, okay? Some ways that you can sacrifice quality is you'll have less time to iterate around testing certain portions of your migration process that may need to be refined by further iterating. So you'll sacrifice quality by just not having time to do those further iterations. You can also put yourself in a position where you have less time to just do the proper UAT testing that would find items that need to be tweaked in order to migrate properly. So this could result in items that have to be managed or fixed or massaged after the migration. That's less than ideal. You could have to accept a lower quality result in the cloud following your migration, which leads to cleanup work that needs to be done post-migration. Whereas had you taken the time to deal with those things beforehand, you wouldn't have that cleanup work to do afterwards. You're also opened up to encountering problems during your production migration. You have typically it's a production migration weekend, and that's a very critical time and process where you want everything to just fall into place. And we work very hard to making things fall into place. But if you make your timeline be too short, like I said, you open yourself up to encountering problems during your production migration that you didn't encounter during testing because your testing was inadequate. And no one ever enjoys that when that happens during a production migration, whether it's the customer or your migration team. So the moral of the story, I'm wrapping up here. If you are migrating and working with a partner that is experienced in cloud migrations, listen to your partner's guidance on what is a reasonable timeline. Also, keep in mind that being flexible regarding your timeline is very important, as a migration process is something that it has many moving parts. Every migration is different, and unforeseen things do tend to pop up. So that's why flexibility is key. And again, like I mentioned before, try to avoid putting yourself into an under the gun or an 11th hour situation regarding when your migration has to be completed, because that just puts the squeeze on it and kind of turns your project into a pressure cooker and leads to those quality sacrifices. Now, sometimes there are customers that know they have to go at a certain time, and they know that they're going to have those quality sacrifices, and they accept that. So that's rare. Every customer is different, but the more time you can give yourself, the better off you'll be. So that's what I have to say about unrealistic short timelines as a pitfall of a cloud migration, Scott.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you, David. And I want to invite people to ask questions, if you think of some, as each of our experts is kind of sharing their anecdotes. We'll also have Q&A at the end, so feel free to bring those as we go or at the end. But we'd love to answer some of your questions as well. Cody, would you like to give us some of your anecdotes next?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Scott. So as Scott had asked and reached out if I'd be willing to share some common pitfalls that we see in migrations, I try to really think back to some issues that either I've gone through or I'm currently experiencing with clients. And so a few key areas that I wanted to dig into was around staging environments for testing migrations, some script conversions as it relates to apps, and identifying API calls in the source environment prior to migrating. So these are all kind of close to home right now. And so I wanted to kind of break down some of the issues that I've recently seen and then some of the solutions we came up with. And so the first one really come on staging environments. Often whenever we work with a client, we'll ask for a staging environment, or there can be other terms for it, a UAT environment, a dev environment, a sandbox environment. essentially just a copy of your source database production environment. And so that way we can do regular testing. We can, change any issues that we find that can help the migration move along. And so, we'll refresh that so that we're constantly working with as fresh data as we can. And that way we can get the most predictable result for a migration. Why we try to avoid production is it just kind of adds to a lengthening process. Can you do it? Yeah. But when it comes down to if we're getting ready to try to do a test migration and there's an issue with, say, a user or a particular workflow, insert whatever the problem is that may be holding up the migration. When we work out of a copy of that gives us a chance just to make a change. We can then present that to the client, but it also allows us to keep our migration moving and then get greater results for what we were trying to initially test. And so it's really important to have this kind of secondary environment where, we in essence can get our hands on the tool and we can try to keep this process moving along as quickly as we can. To David's point, having realistic timelines about all of this, we want to be able to do the work within that time frame and help it go as quickly as we can. So in a recent example, working with a client, they were the product of organizations merging. And so we're seeing a lot of this right now where companies, maybe, purchase another company or for whatever reason, they're trying to consolidate environments. So this was a client that had a on-premise data center environment. They're moving to a cloud environment. And through the process of merging organizations, the people on that would have been directly in charge of the on-premise production environment, there have been changes. They weren't available. They weren't with the company any longer. And so there was no clear defined way to be able to both spin up a copy of their production and refresh it. So at that point, after working through the client and looking internally at what options we had, the conversations had started to evolve around production. We knew that probably wasn't going to be the best approach. So I engaged Conrad on our engineering team to help sit in with the client and talk through what kind of options we may have. And he suggested that we actually self-host their data. And this is something that we've done for clients in the past. Obviously, we had to get clearance through their organization, through their InfoSec teams, working through with them to get a copy of their database, which they're regularly taking, restore that into it's a environment that we're hosting for the environment. So that way we have a sandbox environment. It's technically through us rather than the client, but this gave us a creative solution to be able to do that work we needed to do, perform the testing and not slow down the migration journey that we're going in. And so that was a really, really kind of powerful solution that I think we ended up finding. It's going to significantly help us meet the timelines that we're trying to meet. And so that was a nice solution to be able to find for this particular client. That's just one example of one of the ways that we can do this. And then there's others, but this isn't the one that we ended up going with. It worked best for all parties. The second topic I wanted to kind of bring up, and David had referenced the migration workshop that we had done earlier in the week. And in that, we talk a lot about the complexity of migrations and what it takes to be able to kind of depends on what the complexity of some of the applications you're using. They're not all created equal. Some apps have actually kind of a very simple migration path, or maybe they function more like an integration and it's just copying over some configurations. For this particular instance that I want to bring up, there's some fundamental framework differences between on-premise environments and your cloud environments with some of the app data. So the two that I'm running into right now are actually with Script Runner and JMWE. Both of those, if you do the research, they'll show that they both have a migration path, and they have a lot of detailed information on their support pages as to how to perform the migration. The problem that you can run into with both of these apps, depending on how they've been used or how your environment may be currently using them, is how they're using scripting in a lot of workflow functions. Script Runner has some other pieces that can use it. JMWE, I'll focus more on just the workflow piece on different post functions, but both of those can allow for scripting. Well, on the on-premise environments, those would allow for Groovy scripting. Jira Cloud is not set up to be able to use Groovy scripting in their post functions and their workflows. And so the acceptable formats, the errors you'll get is that they have to be changed over to either nunchucks or Jira expressions. Those are the two acceptable script languages that you can use in cloud. So one thing that we have a process for internally is that we'll do our migration testing, and we'll see which pieces of some of these workflows will migrate, since both these apps I mentioned, Script Runner and JMWE, they'll both migrate, but you'll lose those workflow functions that may have contained a script, or it's now going to error out. You'll get some different behavior based on which application. So internally, we do a process where we'll create our own internal ticket. We'll provide the research data that we have for what the scripts were on the on-premise environment, and then we'll turn that over to our engineering team, who will then work to recreate the comparable scripts in the appropriate language for the app on cloud. And so from there, a lot of times we'll work that in to the post-migration efforts that we'll do. So we'll do the migration. Sorry, I got a little ahead of myself. We'll do some testing prior to migrating. We go to do the production migration. This will be a part of our post-migration steps to rebuild these workflows using the new scripts that we've developed, and then be able to restore that functionality that your teams were used to in their on-premise, on their their data center environment, now in cloud. So that's a nice workaround that we found. It does require some coordination, but it's a great ability for us to be able to migrate those sometimes difficult to move scripts over into cloud. Last but not least, this is one that a topic that I've run into more and more here lately through either some assessments or some migrations, which comes around to the different API calls that maybe happen against your your data center or your server environment. Atlassian has some great documentation as far as how to repoint your APIs to be able to now go towards your new cloud environment. But the issue that we typically run into is that it's hard to sometimes track down how many different teams may be using APIs and in which ways they're using them in order to do the work that they're relying on. We've seen this in a number of different capacities, whereas maybe it's something simple that teams are using just to maybe extract some data, or something way more complex, which is maybe an externally, or sorry, I should say, it's a application or an integration that's been developed by a team within the company, and they are relying heavily on those API calls in order to have this extra tooling be able to function. And so on cloud, Atlassian just recently rolled out some functionality to be able to target all of your API calls that are happening. But unfortunately, there's a little bit of a feature gap on having something comparable on the data center side. And so what we really try to do, or try to encourage all of our clients to do, is engage with your development teams early, talk with your teams, and try to help get an understanding of how many different teams and maybe individual users are making, using some kind of tooling that's requiring API calls. And then from there, provide them with the appropriate ways to repoint those. If it's something more complex and it's going to require, a vast change in tooling, that can lead to bigger conversations with, is this necessary? Maybe there's some cloud native functionality that can replace this tooling you were using. Or possibly it's just extra tooling that needs to be developed. And that's another service that we can actually provide. So another kind of, that'd be the initial way that I'd say to kind of engage your teams, is just start talking to them, maybe put out a poll, whatever, it works best within your organization to try to identify those. Some of the loose ways that we can try to research these a little bit further is through some application logs. It's not a perfect scenario to be able to try to do research, but it is another kind of available option for us to at least try to target some of these. The real the pitfall that happens here is if these paths aren't explored, and say we go to migrate and all the data goes and APIs are not identified one way or another, the real impact to your users is that tooling that they were relying on, whether that was data extraction or whatever, that's now going to be broken. It's going to be looking at an old environment that's no longer in use rather than your new cloud environment. And so can it be fixed? Yes. Is it going to be the end of the world? It just depends on what the seriousness of that particular functionality was and how quickly it can get reconnected to cloud. So that wraps up the three main points that I've kind of been tracking down here recently. Hopefully that helps everyone here on the call today, but thank you all so much for your time. Scott, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thanks. Cody, I think we do have a question here that might relate to you around the staging environment. if we've already, what's the advantage of migrating from a staging environment?
Sorry, you kind of cut out there a little bit on me, Scott. One more time.
Yeah, this question is related to the staging environment. If we've already cleaned up our production environment, what's the advantage of migrating from a staging environment?
Okay. Yeah. So, and there's a variety of different ways to prepare your environments previous to migration, and different strategies involved. Sometimes it's moving everything, it's cleaning up before you move. There's a couple of key migration strategies. But the reason why, again, it's so important for us to be able to work on that staging environment is that there's certain cleanups that can be performed, whether that's users or maybe your custom fields, or determine what apps to be deprecated, consolidate your workflow schemes, so on and so forth. You can go through all of that effort, but when it really comes down to doing the test migrations that we'll be doing to ensure that your production migration will be a success, there can still be little errors that get flagged through either the Jira Cloud Migration Assistant or the Confluence Cloud Migration Assistant that maybe you didn't think of whenever you're going through and doing the cleanup. So in that way, if we were working out of production, the process would look more like this, which is where we're either on some kind of regular meeting cadence, or we have our own dedicated channel to communicate, say through Teams or Slack. And so we have to get approval to make the changes necessary before we can go ahead and move with that test migration that we need to maybe get a greater sense of how well your data is going to migrate. And so that just kind of slows the process down. When we're going through on these migrations, a lot of times there is desires to get migrated by a certain date, or there's some kind of key kind of timeline attached. And so when we're trying to go from production, it can just slow that process down. The other half of it that can turn into an issue is that running the migration assistance, there is going to be more of a performance draw on your system. So would it be a lot? It may depend just on how much data you're trying to migrate and how much work is being performed. But that can still be another impact to your end users that could disrupt your actual business as you're performing. So this way, again, why we recommend you pull from that staging environment is it allows us to do our work, and at the same time, your team can work independently, and then there's no performance drag on either side, or no approval process that can slow everything down. But great question. Hopefully I helped answer that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Absolutely.
All right. We're going to go to our next expert, Conrad. You want to share with us some of your anecdotes?
Yeah, I actually wanted to expand a little on what Cody just said about the apps, especially the ones that are more flexible, like JWE or Script Runner. They're great apps. I love them. Most complex instances actually have them, one of them or both of them, and they are just great. They solve. They're very flexible. They let you solve many problems that you can't solve out of the box with just Jira. But the problem is that if you just look at them, it's something that's very easy to underestimate. So also related to what David just said about the realistic estimates. If you look at the documentation, they say that you can migrate JWE or Script Runner with Migration Assistant just fine, but you don't know what they're actually doing. So it may turn out that you may have 200 workflows that have 500 post functions validators that are coming from apps that may need to be updated manually or semi-manually because they have that groovy code that is just not going to work in cloud. Or another one, it's not just sheer numbers, because there may be 500 trivial scripts, or there may be just a handful, but there may be very complex solutions. And here we have actually seen customers who had such complex solutions built just out of Script Runner, post functions, validators, and listeners weaved together, that recreating that solution alone in the cloud would be a massive undertaking that would be worth its own effort that could actually take months to reproduce in the cloud. And it's also important to understand the fundamental differences between cloud and data center, because it's not just what your code looks like, but also how it's executed and where it's executed. So if you're on data center, all the code, all the apps that you have, they run in the same process as your Jira or as your Confluence. They can slow down processing. So if you have a post function, it's going to be executed sequentially, one post function after another. It can be a drag on performance when you're using those workflows, but you can assume in the next post function that the previous one has already completed. And the same goes for listeners. So you can have those processes with this kind of temporal dependencies or assumptions. That's not going to be the case in cloud. In cloud, everything is, for almost everything runs on, when it comes to the apps, almost everything runs on the third-party vendor infrastructure. So it may be, it may be a data center on the other side of the world even. So something that was a quick post function or a listener that was running right within Jira may now require network call to third-party infrastructure, do some processing there. If it needs to communicate back to Jira, it needs to make some more calls over the network to Atlassian cloud infrastructure and so on. That there are delays associated with that, and that's one of the reasons why they are not executed synchronously in cloud. They are, if you have a listener or a post function in the cloud, it's just a one-way notification from Atlassian to the app that, hey, the transition has just been executed or an event has just happened. And Atlassian products are not going to wait for you to respond to do something with that post function, which means that if you have post functions that depend on what happened previously, they may be running at the same time, they may be running in different order, they may not wait for each other. There are also differences in what third-party apps can technically do. So I mentioned listeners and post functions, but other workflow extensions like conditions and validators, those actually need to be executed synchronously because they affect what you can do in the app. So for that reason, they are limited to different expression language that is it's as flexible as it could reasonably be, but not nearly as flexible as what you could do on data center. So it means that if you have conditions or validators that, for instance, make API calls or run JQL queries or do some complex processing, you may not be able to do that at all in cloud. So it may require some complex workarounds, like maybe we cannot prevent something from happening in a validator, but we can add a post function that would flag it for review or something like that. It's also another limitation of the cloud platform is that on data center, since the apps run in the same process, and it's usually on your infrastructure, there aren't that strong restrictions on how they can modify the user experience and what they can do with the product. They run in the same process. They can inject arbitrary code on the page, change the look and feel, change the behaviors, change what options are available in dialogues, what those dialogues look like, and so on. All kinds of UI modifications. And that's very limited in the cloud, mostly for security reasons. Obviously, because in the cloud, it's the Wild West, so we can't allow third-party vendors to inject arbitrary JavaScript right on your page and do anything with it. So that's also another limitation that you need to be prepared for. I would argue that it's actually good for you because it means that the platform is more secure because the third-party vendors are limited from what they can do to your users or to your environment. But that also means that you lose some of that flexibility. And because another topic that they wanted to bring up is what tools we use for the migration. So we know the Jira Cloud Migration Assistant, and it's pretty much the only way to do a cloud migration, or the only reasonable way to do a cloud migration. But when it comes to third-party apps, they're not always their support for the migration assistant is not always great. Sometimes they, and it's not only that you have custom Groovy code that you need to rewrite manually, but sometimes even if they're not that flexible, those assistant extensions may not be very reliable, or they may not perform very well. So it may turn out that it's a tool that works great for a small migration where you have 100 projects, 100,000 issues. It may work well, but when it comes to a migration that has like 3 million issues, that tool may grind to a halt, or it may fail. And it may fail in different ways on different steps of the process. So it may fail 1 hour into the migration, it may fail 20 hours into the migration. And we usually need to work with the vendor on ironing it out, fixing the bug, whether it's something that we can do on our side, or something that the vendor needs to fix on their end. And sometimes the vendors are pretty responsive and they actually fix bugs for us or improve something on their end. Sometimes we need to come up with contingency plans where we assume that it may work. It worked in most of our tests. If it doesn't, maybe we're going to retry it on Tuesday after the migration weekend, because that's the best we can do with this tool. And some other vendors, they provide tools that are not part of Jira Cloud Migration Assistant or Confluence Cloud Migration Assistant, but those tools there may be like a GitHub repository that has some Python code that may have been written 3 years ago and may or may not be relevant at this point. Or it may be something that, again, works at a small scale, but not at a large one. But when it comes to those tools, at least we have the engineers who can pick them up and update them ourselves to make them work for us. Right. I think that's all I had. Scott, back to you.
All right, thanks, Conrad. Appreciate that. Next, we'll go to Rodolfo. Rodolfo, you have some anecdotes for us?
Yeah, sure, Scott, thank you. You have heard from the other speakers here about how complex Jira migrations can be. There's a lot of planning, coordination, and careful execution involved. But even when the migration is technically complete, our work is far from over. Sometimes it's often after the migration that some of the biggest challenges pop up. As an example of that is dealing with duplicated configurations. And here I'm talking about the duplication of configurations like issue links, priorities, resolutions, project roles, and especially custom fields. These are the building blocks of your Jira environment, and when they get duplicated, it can cause a lot of headaches. So after the migration, after migrating multiple Jira instances into a single one, or even split the migration into separate batches because the number of projects is too big to fit the migration in a weekend, user might see several options for the same priority, like high or critical. Or they might came across many custom fields with identical names, but one has the suffix migrated in the name, so that could cause problems. These duplications, as I said, can cause big issues like user confusion, because when users see multiple versions of the same field or project roles, for example, it creates a lot of uncertainty. They might ended up choosing the wrong option, which leads to inconsistent data and messes up their reports and dashboards. Another example is administrative overload for Jira admins, because managing these duplicates can quickly turn into a full-time job. So instead of focusing on building new projects and working on user requests, they're stuck cleaning up and trying to realign everything. What I can also mention is system performance, because more data, especially unnecessary duplicates, means more load into the system. This can slow down your Jira environment and lead to performance issues that, of course, affect everyone. So after every migration at Valiantes, we try our best to clean as much data as we can using automation and scripting. Sometimes, given the scale of the problem, manual cleanup isn't practical. I would say sometimes it's impossible. That's where scripts come into play to fix these duplicates. To give you guys a few examples, we have build scripts that can scan through all custom fields, spot the duplicates, create the automation rules to merge them into a single field, and finally transfer the screens from one field to another. This one is a very complex one. Another script that can clean migrated tags that are included everywhere after the migration. I don't know why Atlassian decided to put it there, but it is the way it is. For project roles, we have another script that will merge the ones that are duplicated. So for example, if you have a project role called administrators, what usually happens is that you will have another one called administrators migrated. So we copy every user and group from this new one to the one without the migrated tag. And also we modify the permission schemes that are pointing to the migrated project role. Some things are a little bit easier. For example, fixing resolutions, issue links, and priorities. This is because you can delete the migrated one, and Jira will basically ask which one will be the replaced one. So it's easier. It's important to note that usually the migration window is just one weekend. So we try to accommodate all the post-migration activities to occur during this time. Not always possible, but in most cases, that's what happened. So if we don't have a good strategy and scripts on our side, these things can take days to do manually. But with the scripts, it will take a few minutes or a few hours without disruption to the users. Over time, we picked up some best practice that I would like to share a few. We can begin. You think about migrating your data, take a closer look at your current Jira setup, identify potential duplication issues and opportunities to clean up your data. Build a script library. Don't start from scratch every time. Build a library of reusable scripts that can take care of common cleanup tasks. This will save you time and ensure consistency. Test the migration in staging, of course. You will find what was duplicated, and you will have a chance to build the strategy to tackle these issues. It will, if it will be a manual process, or you will have to write some code. You will be defining in this part of the project. Test your solution in staging. Always run your cleanup scripts in a staging environment first. This way you can catch any issues before they impact your live system. And finally, keep the stakeholders in the loop. Make sure they know what's happening and why this cleanup is necessary. It's important for them to understand the long-term benefits of cleaning up and stay everything on the correct place. Maybe look into the future. I think we will see Atlassian migration tools like JCMA to automatically detect and fix these issues during the migration itself. So it will not be necessary to have a bunch of scripts to fix these issues. But until then, automation and scripting are our best tools to keep your environments running smoothly after the migration. I think that's it. I'm happy to answer any questions, but for now, I'll hand it over to you, Scott.
All right, thanks, Rodolfo. Looks like we have about 10 minutes left, and I see a couple of questions in the queue. I'm not sure who they're directed at exactly, but let me throw them out there. This one's regarding app conversion. if the applications have a migration path to cloud, why is a conversion necessary?
You want me to take that one, Scott?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, a lot of times what we see with a lot of apps is that they'll through looking into the app support, it'll there'll be some form of a migration path that exists for the app. The two we were talking about earlier, Script Runner and JMWE, both as Conrad said, they're great apps. They do a lot of wonderful features, and they function very well in both environments, both on-prem and on cloud. But they'll have an automated migration path for those pieces that will function in cloud. And so going back to the scripting, there's certain framework differences that don't allow for, say, Groovy scripting to work. So whereas it states it has an automated migration path, there's still manual pieces that are required in order for all of the functionality to work. So those automated paths may grab the pieces that are guaranteed to work, maybe in different other workflow functions. Trying to think of examples off the top of my head, but the pieces that are known to work in cloud, and what we really do research into is we'll look into the feature parity that exists between how the app functions on both environments, so on-prem and on cloud. Try to line out and identify as many of those that are not going to migrate, so that way we can target those, we can come up with a solution, and then present an option, for approval and or just have a working option for once we move to cloud. So that way there's no real disruption to your team. But yeah, it's just kind of commonplace for a lot of the apps. They'll be listed as an automated migration path. JCMA or CCMA will support those. And then there may still be some manual pieces that have to be performed. I know we talked about workflow pieces that have to be done. I've seen with some Confluence apps, sometimes they'll mention that they have an automated path, but there's still some manual conversion of macros on pages that have to be converted. And it's literally going space by space and using some of the internal tooling built by the app on-prem. So that way those macros are ready to be used in cloud. So, it's not uncommon. It's not, overly common that you run into this issue, but just due to the differences between, the environments, whether you're going from data center to cloud, there may be an automated path for 90% of what's being transferred, but then there's just a little bit that has to be, manually manipulated in order to function. Hopefully that helps answer that question. Anybody else, feel free to chime in if you have any, other pieces to add on that.
Yeah, anybody else want to chime in on that? Okay, one more question here. This one's regarding API calls. And Cody, this one might tie back to your presentation as well, or Conrad's, I'm not sure. The question is, what's the impact if we miss an API call during the migration?
Yeah, I kind of briefly touched on that. Really, the what you'll run into is your users, whatever the tooling they're using connected to the API call. Maybe it's just as simple as they're extracting information, or they're using it in a way for it to, connect with some kind of an external integration, and those API calls are being made against your on-prem environment. When you move to cloud, that user, the work that they're used to doing every single day, that will now be in essence broken. So if they're extracting certain pieces of data, work has stopped being performed in your on-premise environment. We've migrated, so there's no new work being performed there. All your new work is being performed in cloud, and so that data is no longer helpful. You're not getting the fresh pieces maybe that you need. So a lot of times, or maybe not a lot of times, that's the wrong way to say it, but the users will find that they log in to go to work, and they're trying to see why this integration may be broken, and it's due to that they haven't repointed that API to work within cloud, and maybe as far as to not even test if it will work properly with cloud. And then there's a disruption there that can affect the work that they do, the way they rely on those API calls, and then there's a discovery period, there's a reconnection period, there's some troubleshooting that has to happen in order to get that to reconnect. So that's why it's important to try to, get that word out to your users as early as you can. If they are using them, you can get them repointed, or at least provide them with the information on how to repoint them to cloud whenever the time comes. And it just helps prevent that, maybe unnecessary gap in functionality loss. So we want to get as much testing done during the migration process, and API calls are just one of those kind of tricky areas for us to be able to pinpoint. There's no real easy way on data center to be able to find all of them and one fell swoop kind of report output, and that way you can immediately target those users using them. So it's a little bit more of a deep discovery, kind of verbal communication with your teams to determine who's using what. But that's the real kind of rub to it, is that when you go through production migration weekend, if they're not captured, they just kind of get forgotten about, and then you have to go through the process of getting them fixed.
Awesome, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I think that that completes all the questions we have. I want to thank all of our experts for being panelists for us here today. And thank you for those in attendance and for your questions. I've got one final slide to share, just in case you want more information about Valiantis and about the services that we offer. Maybe some of this migration expertise is something that you or your organization need. You can reach out to myself or my co-host, Ariel Da Silva. You see the email addresses on the screen, and I believe that's going to be in chat also. And Ariel wasn't able to be with us today, but hopefully he'll be back with us next month. Also, we're going to share a link to upcoming events that you might be interested in. There are several things that are coming up, that opportunities for you to learn and to grow for free. And some of these are paid opportunities, like some of the boot camps you see there. But some really great learning opportunities, and we'd love for you to join us in some of those. And finally, thank you so much for your time. And if you weren't able to ask a question, or you didn't, you're viewing this online, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And hopefully we'll see you next month at Ask the Experts on September the 19th. Thanks, everyone.